Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning with Story 1, The Unseen Universe of Copernicus. You are lying in bed. The year is 1473. You are in the city of Toruń in the Kingdom of Poland. The wind drifts gently through wooden shutters, and below, the Vistula River whispers against its muddy banks. It is here, in the cool silence of a merchant's home, that a child named Nicolaus Copernicus is born. No one knows it yet, but this quiet, reserved, mathematically gifted will someday turn the entire universe inside out. The early years, shadows of influence. Copernicus was not a revolutionary by appearance. He was a canon of the cathedral in Frombork, a position more bureaucratic than holy. He did not preach fiery sermons or lead protests. He observed, he calculated, he read deeply into ancient texts. He copied diagrams slowly, deliberately. He repaired walls, managed cathedral lands, and oversaw grain shipments. The details of his daily life were, by all accounts, painfully dull, but the ideas he carried in his headspace were not. Raised by his uncle, a bishop with influence and ambition, Copernicus was given access to Europe's best education. He studied in Krakow, where mathematics and astronomy took hold of his imagination. Later, in Italy, he absorbed Greek, Latin, and law. But above all, he read De Sphera Mundi, the dominant astronomical text of the medieval period. Based on Ptolemy's Earth-centered model, it had ruled European thought for over 1,000 years. But something didn't sit right. The problem with the heavens. According to Ptolemy, the Earth sat at the center of a series of perfect crystal spheres, each carrying a planet, the moon, the sun, and the stars. These spheres rotated in intricate patterns known as epicycles to account for retrograde motion, strange way planets sometimes appeared to move backward in the sky. This model was deeply complicated, but it was accepted because it worked, mostly. To Copernicus, the Ptolemaic system began to look like a patchwork quilt of mathematical fictions. It worked not because it was right, but because it was forced to. The deeper he went, the more uncomfortable he became. This discomfort didn't manifest as an explosion. It simmered. In 1514, he circulated a short handwritten manuscript among a small group of astronomers. It was called the Commentariolus. In it, he made a gentle but extraordinary claim that the Earth was not the center of the universe. The sun was. Few outside his circle paid attention. Why would they? Copernicus had no telescope, no great public forum. He was a canon, not a crusader, but he had years of patient, quiet calculations on his side. A cosmological reversal. To fully understand the daring nature of Copernicus's heliocentric model, one must consider the world around him. In Europe at the time, the cosmos was not just a scientific structure, it was a moral and theological one. The earth was seen as fallen and corrupt, while the heavens were divine and unchanging. To suggest the earth moved especially in a circular orbit was to upend this entire spiritual architecture. Copernicus did not do this recklessly. He delayed the publication of his magnum opus, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, for decades. He hesitated, not from fear, it seems, but from an obsession with precision. His data was flawed by today's standards, but it represented a lifetime of careful, even obsessive, observation and math. And then, as legend has it, on his deathbed in 1543, he finally received the first printed copy of his book. He looked at it once, then slipped away. Reaction and silence. Oddly, the book caused little initial uproar. Perhaps it was too technical, perhaps it was published too late, or perhaps the implications hadn't yet been fully realized. It opened with a preface added by a Lutheran clergyman without Copernicus's consent, suggesting it was just a mathematical convenience, not a literal truth. But for those who read beyond the preface, the claim was clear: the earth moved, the sun was still, the stars did not spin each night, instead we did. The universe had been recentered. And yet, even in this revolution, there were uncertainties. His model still relied on circular orbits. It still required epicycles. It was not a clean break, but a philosophical earthquake waiting for aftershocks. Unresolved thought. If Copernicus only proposed a slightly more elegant model still reliant on circular orbits and flawed datui, did his idea eventually change the course of Western thought? What made the slow wheels of revolution begin to turn? The ink of De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium had barely dried before its impact began to ripple not in the streets, not from pulpits or courts, but in quiet studies, remote monasteries, and the early morning solitude of scattered astronomers. For a work that claimed to restructure the entire cosmos, its arrival was almost eerily calm. But beneath the silence, something had shifted. The earth had been moved, and no one was quite sure how to put it back. A book few could understand. You, in your study in mid-16th century Europe, might have picked up Copernicus's book if you were a scholar, a monk, or perhaps a physician with an interest in astronomy. It was dense. The Latin was formal, the diagrams sparse, the conclusions tucked deep into geometric demonstrations. This was not a popular tract. It was a book for calculators and calendar makers. In fact, many readers may not have been entirely sure what Copernicus was proposing. The earth moved, in a circle, around the sun. The heavens were no longer spinning overhead. For many, the old geocentric model had simply worked. It kept the feast days in line. It predicted eclipses with acceptable accuracy. There was little urgency to change. Yet, among those who did understand, those who traced the implications line by line, questions began to sprout like weeds in a forgotten garden. Quiet readers and quiet questions. One such reader was the Lutheran mathematician Erasmus Reinhold, who appreciated the computational improvements of Copernicus's tables. He didn't necessarily accept the heliocentric model, but he acknowledged that Copernicus's method produced more accurate results for planetary positions. Reinhold's Prutenic tables, based on Copernican data, found their way into the hands of calendar reformers and navigators alike. Another cautious supporter was Georg Joachim Rheticus, Copernicus's only known student and a passionate advocate for the heliocentric theory. Rheticus had pushed his mentor to publish De Revolutionibus, even helping finance its printing. He believed in the system and attempted to spread its message through teaching and correspondence, but his efforts faced resistance, both institutional and personal. Still, the theory spread, not like fire but like frost, slow, quiet, and persistent. In Denmark, Tycho Brahe, a man with a golden nose, a private island, and an obsession with observation, read the Copernican system and rejected it. To Brahe, the Earth's lack of observable motion was conclusive. He offered a compromise, a geoheliocentric model where the planets orbited the Sun and the Sun orbited the Earth. It preserved some elegance of Copernicus's math but kept the Earth rooted in place. Brahe's compromise showed the deep discomfort Copernicus's idea provoked. To accept it meant more than changing equations. It meant redefining humanity's place in the universe. Calendar chaos and the Church's dilemma. The Catholic Church, meanwhile, had its own interest in astronomy, not out of scientific curiosity, but for liturgical order. The Julian calendar, in use since the time of Caesar, had drifted nearly 10 days off the solar year by the 16th century. This misalignment meant that Easter, tied to the equinox, was slowly shifting out of season. It was a serious problem. In 1582, under Pope Gregory XIII, the Gregorian calendar was introduced. It corrected the drift by removing 10 days from the year and refining the leap year system. Behind the scenes, astronomers used elements of Copernican calculations to inform this reform, though they were careful not to endorse heliocentrism outright. The work of Copernicus, the man, was being adopted, but his model, that remained taboo. This tension between practical use and ideological resistance would define the next century of scientific development. The stars that refused to move. One of the great challenges to heliocentrism was a problem of motion. If Earth were moving, why couldn't people feel it? Why did dropped objects fall straight down instead of curving westward as the ground sped beneath them? Why did the stars not shift their positions as Earth orbited the Sun? That last issue, the absence of stellar parallax, was especially troubling. In theory, if Earth moved, then the background of stars should shift slightly throughout the year. Yet no such shift could be detected with the naked eye. Copernicans argued that the stars must be unimaginably far away, so far that the tiny shift was imperceptible. But to most, that seemed implausible. The universe would have to be vastly larger than anyone had conceived. It was a paradox. In order to make the Copernican model work, the cosmos had to be expanded beyond the limits of human imagination. The Earth would become just another planet, orbiting an ordinary star in a nearly infinite void. It was not just science, it was philosophical vertigo. Seeds of doubt, roots of change. Still, over time, the model began to attract more serious attention. Not because it was obvious, or simple, or emotionally satisfying, but because it made certain predictions cleaner, and because it planted a seed. That the universe might be understood not by appealing to perfection or tradition, but through observation and mathematics. But Copernicus had not provided that final push. He had not proven the Earth moved. He had only suggested that the math worked better if it did. The seed needed another gardener, and he was coming. In Pisa, a young mathematics professor with a fondness for experimentation and a sharp tongue was beginning to point a crude telescope at the heavens. What he would see would shift the debate entirely from hypothesis to confrontation. Unresolved thought. If Copernicus raised the question, and his followers carried it cautiously forward, what would happen when someone finally saw the heavens and could offer real evidence? What would happen when observation no longer aligned with the teachings of authority? You open your eyes in the dusky silence of a Florentine study. The year is now 1609. The scent of ink and old parchment lingers in the air. Outside, the bells of the cathedral echo faintly. Inside, a man in his mid-40s squints through a narrow tube, his hands trembling slightly, not from age, but from anticipation. His name is Galileo Galilei, and what he is about to see will finally give Copernicus's theory the proof it had lacked for nearly 70 years. A lens from across the Alps. The telescope was not Galileo's invention. Word of it came from the Netherlands, an odd little device made by spectacle makers to magnify distant objects. But Galileo improved the design with careful craftsmanship and sharper lenses. He increased its magnification tenfold. More importantly, he pointed it at the sky. In doing so, he transformed the telescope from a tool of warfare and trade into a weapon of scientific revolution. When he turned it to the moon, he saw not the smooth, crystalline surface that Aristotelian cosmology had taught, but jagged shadows, mountains, and craters like Earth's. The moon, it seemed, was not heavenly at all. It was made of the same material as the terrestrial world. When he observed Jupiter, he saw something stranger. 4 small moonstony stars that orbited the planet. This discovery was explosive. It was not just that moons existed elsewhere. It was that celestial bodies could orbit something other than Earth. And then came the most devastating blow to geocentrism, the phases of Venus. Like the moon, Venus showed a full set of phases. According to Ptolemy's model, this was impossible, but it was perfectly explained if Venus orbited the Sun. Copernicus's once quiet hypothesis had just received a resounding echo from the sky. Galileo's writings, dialogue and drama. Galileo, unlike Copernicus, was not content to whisper in Latin to a closed circle of scholars. He wrote in Italian. He published pamphlets. He named the Jovian moons after the Medici family for patronage. He was charismatic, clever, and at times careless in his defiance. In 1632, Galileo published dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Framed as a conversation between three characters sown for Copernicus, one for Ptolemy, and a third, foolishly named Simpliciade book argued strongly for the heliocentric model. The implication was clear. Geocentrism was not just outdated, it was laughable. The Church, which had until then tolerated Galileo's work with uneasy silence, now responded with fury. Trial and silence. The Catholic Church had entered a period of heightened scrutiny during the Counter-Reformation. While Copernicus had avoided the worst of theological backlash by dying at the right time, Galileo was not so lucky. In 1616, the Church had declared heliocentrism formally heretical because it contradicted the Scriptures' apparent references to a stationary Earth. Galileo had been warned not to advocate it as truth. By 1633, after the dialogue stirred public controversy, he was tried by the Roman Inquisition. The trial was less about astronomy and more about obedience. Galileo was accused of violating the Church's earlier warning and of spreading ideas dangerous to the established order. He recanted under threat of torture. Legend says he muttered "E per se muove," and yet it moves, as he stood perhaps apocryphal, perhaps not. He spent the remainder of his life under house arrest in his villa near Florence, forbidden from teaching or writing on cosmology. But the Damagito, the geocentric worldview, was done. Long-term reverberations. Even as Galileo was silenced, the telescope could not be uninvented. Other astronomers took up the mantle. Johannes Kepler refined Copernicanism further, replacing its flawed circular orbits with ellipses, solving the problem of planetary speed variations. Isaac Newton, later in the 17th century, would mathematically explain why planets moved as they did, giving a final, unifying push to a universe governed by natural laws, not divine spheres. But it had all begun with Copernicus, a man who doubted in silence, calculated in solitude, and dared to imagine the Earth as merely one planet among many. And it had matured through Galilei, a man who gazed upward with new instruments, challenged the authorities of his time, and suffered for the truth he believed the stars were shouting. A reordered cosmos. The impact of Copernicus and Galileo was not confined to astronomy. Once the Earth was no longer the center of the universe, the intellectual center of gravity shifted as well. If the heavens could be reinterpreted through observation, so could biology, physics, even politics. The scientific revolution had its seed in Copernicus's table sand, its roots tangled deep into European thought for centuries to come. More than new data, this era introduced a new method: to observe, to question, to doubt, and to test. It was a quiet shift, but once the Earth had been moved, the mind could not return to stillness. Final reflection. In a world now filled with telescopes and space telescopes, where we see galaxies billions of light years away, do we ever pause to remember the moment when one man, watching the stars through imperfect lenses, dared to move the Earth with nothing more than thought? Story 2. Tycho Brahe and the Island of Data. You are standing on a small island off the coast of Denmark. The year is 1580. Around you, sea winds press against stone walls and faint echoes of brass instruments clatter within observatories that rise like medieval fortresses. This is not a military base. It is a scientific compound, a place of charts, angles, celestial clocks. You are on Hven, Tycho Brahe's private island, where the stars are measured by hand and the cosmos is recorded with fanatical precision. There are no telescopes yet, no computers, no automation, just a man with a metal nose, a loyal staff of assistants, and the most accurate instruments the world has ever seen, all designed to solve the ancient riddle of the skis. A noble birth and a missing nose. Tycho Brahe was born in 1546 into Danish nobility, wealthy, eccentric, and expected to serve the crown. But his destiny turned skyward when he was just a teenager. At age 13, he witnessed a solar eclipse that occurred exactly as predicted. He was captivated not just by the spectacle, but by the power of mathematical precision. Though intended for a career in law, Tycho secretly studied astronomy, collecting instruments, calculating angles. He was also known for his vanity and pride. In 1566, he famously lost part of his nose in a duel, possibly over a mathematical disagreement. He wore a prosthetic for the rest of his life, believed to be made of brass or silver. The nose became part of his legend, but what truly set Tycho apart was his lifelong obsession, measuring the heavens accurately, down to the smallest observable arc minute. He would spend the next 3 decades doing exactly that. Uraniborg, a fortress for the stars. In 1576, King Frederick II of Denmark granted Tycho his own island Hven and a generous stipend to build an observatory. The result was Uraniborg, Castle of the Heavens, a complex unlike anything else in Europe. This was no mere tower with a telescope. It was a fully functioning research institution. There were multiple observation towers, specially built quadrants and sextants, printing presses, underground alchemy laboratories, even carefully managed gardens to sustain his staff and impress royal visitors. Dozens of assistants and students lived and worked there, gathering nightly data on the positions of stars and planets, recording everything by hand. They worked in silence, in darkness, in cold, just to record the positions of dots in the sky, again and again, with instruments that Tycho designed to eliminate error. He rejected Copernicus's heliocentric model, arguing that it was not supported by the evidence, especially the absence of observable stellar parallax. And yet, Tycho was not a reactionary. He believed in reform, in data, in the precision of observation. He simply wanted a model that matched what the eye could see. And so he created one. The Tychonic system, a cosmic compromise. Tycho's own cosmological model, published in the 1580s, proposed a curious hybrid. The Earth remained stationary at the center of the universe, but the Sun orbited the Earth, and all other planets orbited the Sun. It preserved the theological and philosophical centrality of Earth, while integrating the more efficient mathematics of Copernican heliocentrism. It was a compromise, scientifically elegant and politically convenient. It even made some predictions better than Ptolemy's system. But Tycho was not interested in theory for theory's sake. He was building a foundation. He once said, "I have studied these things not to know them but to measure them." He believed that only through rigorous data charts, measurements, years of careful observation could one understand the cosmos. The new star in the crumbling sky. In 1572, Tycho observed a bright new object in the sky, a new star, or nova, which appeared in the constellation Cassiopeia and remained visible for months. The existence of a new star challenged the Aristotelian idea that the heavens were unchanging and perfect. Tycho's meticulous documentation of this nova provided evidence that celestial spheres, if they even existed, could be ruptured. The heavens were not immutable. Then, in 1577, he observed a comet cutting across the supposedly solid crystalline spheres. If those spheres were real, the comet should have been blocked. It was. Again, Tycho's instruments and calculations revealed a sky more dynamic and more unstable than traditional cosmology allowed. This was not just academic, it was philosophical. If the heavens could change, if they could decay, then perhaps they were not so different from Earth after all. A scientist, a courtier, a bureaucrat. While Tycho Brahe was brilliant, he was also difficult. He demanded loyalty, attention, and reverence. He styled himself as both a noble and a scientist, wearing fine clothes, hosting grand dinners, and ensuring his name was inscribed on everything he published. He quarreled with subordinates, with fellow astronomers, even with royalty. After King Frederick II died in 1588, Tycho's fortunes declined. The new king, Christian IV, was less impressed with the lavish expenses of Uraniborg. In 1597, Tycho was forced to leave Denmark, taking his data and his bitterness with him. He wandered for a time before finally finding refuge under the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II in Prague. There, he built a new observatory and began work on his greatest project, the Rudolphine Tables, a comprehensive star catalogue intended to redefine astronomy. But by then, Tycho's own time was running out. An assistant with ambition. While in Prague, Tycho hired a young German mathematician named Johannes Kepler. Kepler was brilliant, driven, and devoutly Copernican. The two men had a rocky relationship. Tycho guarded his data jealously, and Kepler was impatient for access. But fate intervened. In 1601, Tycho Brahe died suddenly from a ruptured bladder after refusing to leave a royal banquet early. As legend tells it, he considered it impolite to excuse himself. Upon his death, Tycho's vast trove of observational data passed to Kepler. It was this data impossibly detailed, painstakingly measured, without telescopes that allowed Kepler to make a series of groundbreaking discoveries about planetary motion. Tycho had measured the stars more accurately than anyone before him, but it would be Kepler who revealed what those measurements truly meant. Unresolved thought. If Tycho Brahe's legacy was his data and his data changed everything, how did Kepler use it to undo centuries of circular assumptions? And what unexpected truths did he uncover while trying to prove Copernicus right? In a quiet study in Prague, sometime after 1601, a man sits hunched over stacks of yellowing papers. He runs his hands across numbers inked by another man's handtables of planetary positions, careful records of Mars, angles written and rewritten with obsessive care. This man is Johannes Kepler, and he is about to discover that the universe does not move in circles. It moves in ellipses. But getting to that truth will not be quick, nor will it be easy. These pages Tycho Brahe's life's work are a gift and a curse. A reluctant partnership. Kepler had arrived in Prague hopping to prove Copernicus right. He believed deeply that the universe was designed by God in perfect harmony and that the heliocentric model held divine geometric symmetry. But Tycho Brahe didn't fully trust him. He granted Kepler limited access to his prized Mars data, rationed page by page like bread during a siege. Tycho feared that Kepler might publish theories too quickly, misusing or claiming credit for his decades of work. Kepler, for his part, was desperate. He wrote letters filled with pleading. "Give me your Mars," he begged. For Kepler, Mars was the key. It moved irregularly, more obviously than other planets, revealing flaws in both Ptolemaic and Copernican models. If Mars could be explained, perhaps everything could. When Tycho died suddenly in 1601, Kepler inherited his position as imperial mathematician and, more importantly, the full breadth of Tycho's data. Now he had the numbers, and they refused to behave. The War of Circles. Kepler's first major task was to use Tycho's Mars data to understand its orbit. He began with the assumption that Copernicus was right. Planets orbited the sun in perfect circles. It was a sacred idea chode in Christian Neoplatonism, in which the circle was considered the most divine of all shapes. But no matter how he adjusted the model, the numbers didn't fit. The errors were just 8 arcminutes off. That's about 1/4 the width of your pinky held up at arm's length, but Tycho's measurements were too good to ignore. Kepler couldn't dismiss the discrepancy. So he set out to refine the model. He tested circles upon circles. He created epicycles. He adjusted for Earth's motion. He did trigonometry until his eyes ached. Nothing worked. Then, reluctantly, he tried something that had never been proposed before, an oval. More precisely, an ellipse. And suddenly, the numbers began to click. The first law, elliptical orbits. Kepler's breakthrough came not from pure inspiration, but from relentless calculation. Tycho's data, precise and unyielding, had forced his hand. He stated his finding plainly. The orbit of a planet is an ellipse, with the sun at one of the two foci. This was Kepler's first law of planetary motion. It was a monumental departure from 1,500 years of circular thinking. The heavens, once thought to move in perfect circles around a stationary Earth or sun, instead moved in elongated loops, slow in some places, fast in others. The planets sped up as they approached the sun and slowed down as they drifted away. It was not beautiful, it was not perfect, but it was real. The second law, areas in time. Kepler wasn't finished. He noticed that planets didn't move at constant speeds. Instead, their speed changed depending on their distance from the sun. He formalized this as his second law. A line joining a planet, and the sun sweeps out equal areas in equal times. This meant that a planet in an elliptical orbit would move faster when it was closer to the sun, and slower when it was farther away. This was radical. It implied that planetary motion was governed by some force of something not constant, something tied to distance. Kepler had no physics to explain it yet, that would be Newton's task, but he knew the math worked. Tycho's meticulous records of Mars, taken over 2 decades, had revealed something Copernicus never could, a system that was not just centered on the sun, but defined by motion, distance, and change. The universe was not static, it pulsed. The harmony of the world. Kepler was a man of faith and mysticism, as much as a scientist. He believed that God had written the universe in the language of geometry. For years, he tried to fit the planetary distances into the framework of the 5 Platonic solid shapes like the cube and dodecahedron. His early book Mysterium Cosmographicum was filled with such visions. But after discovering elliptical orbits, he matured. He began to accept that the cosmos was not just a machine of beauty, it was also a machine of mechanics. Still, he didn't abandon his dream of harmony. In 1619, he published Harmonics Mundi, The Harmony of the World, where he introduced his third law. The square of the orbital period of a planet is proportional to the cube of its average distance from the sun. This law connected time to space. How long a planet takes to complete one orbit depends on how far it is from the sun. Kepler had now revealed the structure of the solar system in full: shape, speed, and distance. 3 laws, no telescope, no physics textbook, just Tycho's data, some hand-drawn diagrams, and years of dogged labor. Kepler the survivor. Kepler's life was not easy. He lost his first wife and several children to disease. He was excommunicated from his Lutheran church for heresy. He defended his mother when she was accused of witchcraft, was eventually imprisoned and nearly executed. He worked in relative poverty, often unpaid, forced to move from city to city during the chaos of the 30 Years' War. He was never revered in his lifetime the way Galileo was. Yet he persevered, driven by his obsession to know the truth, no matter how ugly or undivine it appeared. He believed in God, but he also believed in numbers, and when they came into conflict, he let the numbers win. Tycho's legacy fulfilled. In the end, Tycho Brahe's fortress on the island of Hven had not produced a cosmological model of its own, but it had gathered something more valuable: data, honest and exact. And it was that data, rejected by the Ptolemists, doubted by theologians, passed down to a reluctant assistant, that cracked the circular code of the heavens. The island had spoken, and Kepler had listened. Unresolved thought. Kepler's laws described how planets moved, but not why. What was the force that pulled the planets along those elliptical paths? What invisible hand governed motion across such vast distances? Would the final answer require yet another observerone who could unite motion, mass, and force into a single theory? You're now in Cambridge, England. The air is colder. The candles burn a little slower. The year is 1666, the year of miracles. A young man sits in isolation as the Great Plague shuts down the universities. His notebooks are filled with scribbles about motion, falling bodies, and the movements of planets. His name is Isaac Newton, and though he is alone, he is not unaided. Beside him lie the scattered truths of the previous century: Copernicus's sun, Tycho's data, and Kepler's ellipses. From these fragments, he is about to build a structure so profound that it will reshape not only science, but human thought itself. The questions left unanswered. Kepler had described planetary motion with stunning precision. His laws showed what the planets were doing: how fast, how far, how elliptical. But they never answered the next question. Why? Why should planets move faster near the sun? What force kept them in orbit? Why didn't they fly off into space? For decades, thinkers wrestled with these questions. Some proposed mysterious magnetic forces. Others relied on divine harmony, but none could provide a testable, mathematical explanation. It would take a man who saw motion not as an isolated phenomenon, but as part of a universal pattern. Newton's insight, the apple that fell. The story is simple, perhaps apocryphal. Newton sees an apple fall and wonders why. Not just why the apple fell to earth, but why the moon didn't. Why did the apple fall straight down, but the moon continued circling the earth? Was there a connection between them? The apple didn't just fall, it accelerated. And that acceleration, Newton realized, wasn't special, it was universal. Gravity wasn't limited to falling apples. It governed everything from cannonballs to comets. If gravity reached from the earth to the apple, might it also reach from the sun to the planets? What if gravity was the missing force behind Kepler's laws? The law of universal gravitation. In the 1680s, Newton formalized his ideas in his great work, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematicae, simply, the Principia. There he proposed this fundamental law. Every particle of matter in the universe attracts every other particle with a force that is directly proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. This was the law of universal gravitation. In one sentence, Newton connected the earth and the heavens. The same force that pulled the apple to the ground also kept the moon in orbit. The same mathematics applied to falling bodies and the dance of the planets. Tycho Brahe had measured the heavens. Kepler had described their curves. Newton had explained why they moved that way. The calculus of motion. To make sense of this motion, Newton developed a new form of mathematics, calculus. Though others, like Leibniz, developed similar tools independently, it was Newton who used them to describe acceleration, force, and change over time. He introduced 3 laws of motion that governed all physical objects. Inertia. Objects remain at rest or in uniform motion unless acted upon. F equals ma. Force equals mass times acceleration. Action and reaction. For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. With these he could model everything: the flight of projectiles, the behavior of tides, and most important lithe elliptical paths that Kepler had found. Kepler's laws were no longer just observations. They were consequences of Newton's theory of motion and gravity. From island data to universal law. Let's pause to reflect. Tycho Brahe had stood on an island and measured the sky with metal instruments. He had never seen a telescope. His numbers were gathered through sweat and stubbornness. Yet those numbers, passed reluctantly to Kepler, became the fuel for a theory of planetary motion. And now, decades later, Newton took those paths, those ellipses, and showed that they were not mysterious or mystical. They were the result of a single, natural law acting across the entire universe. It was one of the most powerful shifts in the history of thought. The cosmos no longer ran on divine perfection, but on measurable, mathematical, universal laws. The same laws that governed cannonballs governed comets. The heavens and earth were united at last. Aftermath, the clockwork universe. With Newton's work, the scientific revolution reached a kind of climax. The universe was now envisioned as a giant clockwork, a vast machine that could be studied, predicted, and understood. For nearly 2 centuries after Newton, this mechanical view of the world dominated science. Astronomers could predict eclipses centuries in advance. Engineers used Newton's mechanics to build bridges, machines, and ships. But Newton's theories didn't just explain how the world worked. They implied something deeper, that nature was not arbitrary, it was lawful, knowable, understandable by human minds. This was not just a scientific idea, it was a cultural revolution. A legacy in shadows and numbers. Newton, like Kepler and Tycho before him, was not a man of comfort. He worked in solitude, feared criticism, and feuded with rivals. He studied alchemy and biblical prophecy as much as mathematics, but in the world of science, his work became foundational. All 3 men, Tycho, Kepler, and Newton, were, in many ways, bridge builders. Tycho gathered the raw observations, Kepler uncovered the geometric truths, and Newton offered the unifying principles. It was a relay race across time, across nations, across ideologies. Each had his flaws. Each had moments of doubt, superstition, or vanity. But together, they moved humanity from a cosmos of crystal spheres to a universe of motion and gravity. All because a man with a brass nose insisted that the stars be measured, not merely believed in. Final reflection. In a modern world filled with digital telescopes and orbiting satellites, it's easy to forget how the scientific revolution actually unfolded, not in bold declarations, but in dusty notebooks, sleepless calculations, and endless argument. It was a story of data, of doubt, of one assistant inheriting a legacy, of ellipses discovered under candlelight, of apples that fell in minds that asked why. And behind it all, an island where the stars were once tracked by hand, every night for decades. A fortress not of war, but of patience. Story 3. Johannes Kepler's Laws and the Geometry of Heaven. You find yourself in the town of Weil-der-Stadt, in the Swabian region of the Holy Roman Empire. The year is 1571. It is a world shaped by the Protestant Reformation and political instability, yet filled with the quiet hum of celestial ambition. It is here that Johannes Kepler is born, a sickly child with weak eyesight, born into poverty, but destined to see the universe more clearly than most ever would. He would not wield a telescope. He would not stand on observatory walls like Tycho. His tools were different geometry, harmony, intuition, and an unshakable belief that God had written the cosmos in the language of mathematics. This is not the story of the man who discovered planets. It is the story of the man who discovered how they moved. The shape of belief. Kepler was a man of contradictions. He was deeply religious, trained in Lutheran theology, and believed the universe was designed with divine symmetry. But he also questioned doctrine. He was a man of science but steeped in mysticism. He was a mathematician but prone to numerological speculation. In 1596, Kepler published Mysterium Cosmographicum, his first major work. In it, he proposed that the distances between the 6 known planets could be explained by the nesting of the 5 Platonic solids: cube, tetrahedron, dodecahedron, icosahedron, and octahedron between their orbits. It was a beautiful idea, geometrically perfect and profoundly wrong. But the failure of that model did not dissuade Kepler. It only deepened his belief. There was a pattern to the cosmos, and he would find it not through divine revelation, but through reason and mathematics. The call to Graz. Kepler was appointed as a mathematics teacher in Graz, in present-day Austria. While there, he worked on astronomy as a sideline, still defending Copernicanism. But in 1600, religious tensions forced him to flee. He was Protestant in a Catholic city during a time of persecution. He left under duress, his wife and children following shortly after. This instability would mark much of his life: persecution, exile, financial hardship. But in a twist of fate, his move brought him into contact with one of the most important figures of the era, Tycho Brahe. The Danish nobleman had been invited to Prague by Emperor Rudolf II. Kepler, with nowhere else to turn, found himself in Brahe's service. At first, the relationship was strained. Tycho was proud, controlling, and secretive. Kepler was brilliant, ambitious, and impatient. But Tycho saw his potential and gave him a difficult task: figure out the orbit of Mars. It would take Kepler 6 years, thousands of calculations, and the collapse of circular perfection to get it right. Mars, the troublesome planet. Why Mars? Because it was difficult. Of all the known planets, Mars displayed the most irregular motion. It moved faster and slower, forward and backward, shifting in brightness and position unpredictably. This behavior had long confounded astronomers. Tycho's data on Mars, taken over 2 decades, was the most precise ever recorded, so precise that Kepler found even small discrepancies between theory and observation. He began with circular orbits, as tradition dictated. But no matter how many epicycles he added, no matter how carefully he adjusted Earth's position, the model always came up short. The discrepancy was smallied arcminutes, but Kepler knew what Tycho would have said: a single-minute error destroys the whole theory. So he pushed further. He tried ovals. He tested hypothetical spirals. He considered off-center circles. Eventually, almost in despair, he turned to the ellipse. And that's when it happened. The data clicked. Mars's orbit wasn't a circle. It was an ellipse with the sun at one focus. It was a painful revelation for Kepler, who had spent years trying to fit the universe into perfect shapes. But it was the truth. For the first time, someone had described a planet's motion accurately. Kepler's first law was born not from vision, but from surrendering to what the numbers demanded: the harmony of speed. The next discovery came from what seemed to be an afterthought. As Kepler tracked Mars along its elliptical path, he noticed that the planet did not move at a constant speed. It moved faster when near the sun and slower when far away. This was not just a curiosity, it was a pattern. He quantified it and found that a line drawn from the sun to Mars would sweep out equal areas in equal times, regardless of the planet's position in its orbit. This became Kepler's second law, the law of equal areas. It implied a new relationship between distance and speed, a rhythm to planetary motion that no one had seen before. It was not mechanical in the way gears turn. It was organic, flowing like music or tides. He had not yet found the cause, but he had found the shape, the speed, the pulse of the planets. Personal turmoil, cosmic order. Kepler's life, while filled with discovery, was riddled with hardship. His first wife, Barbara, suffered frequent illness and died young. Of his 12 children, only a few survived. He lived through war, famine, and religious intolerance. He often struggled financially and changed employers repeatedly. In 1615, his own mother was accused of witchcraft, a common fate for women in early modern Europe. She was imprisoned for over a year. Kepler, despite his responsibilities and poverty, took up her legal defense, himself researching court procedures, writing briefs, and appealing to authorities. He eventually secured her release. All the while, he continued working on the heavens. In 1619, he published Harmonics Mundi, the harmony of the world, where he introduced Kepler's third law. The square of a planet's orbital period is proportional to the cube of its distance from the Sun. It was the final key. Time and space, motion and distance, all locked together in a mathematical symphony. The first planetary physics. Though Kepler lacked the tools of calculus or Newtonian mechanics, he was the first to grasp that the planets were not just following ideal paths, they were being pulled. He wrote of a force emanating from the Sun, like magnetism. He didn't yet understand gravity, but he saw hints of it. Kepler even speculated on what would happen if Earth's motion ceased. Imagine the planet falling into the Sun, centuries before Newton formalized that very idea. His understanding of motion was still tangled with metaphysical ideas, divine music, geometrical perfection, but the numbers never lied. What had begun with Copernicus's speculative sun-centered model had become something measurable, predictive, and increasingly physical. Unresolved thought. If Kepler had described the paths and the pulses of the planets, who would come along to explain the wider show, not only the pattern, but the force behind it? And would the explanation be as beautiful as the geometry he left behind? It is 1620, and the war drums of the 30 Years' War echo across the Holy Roman Empire. Towns are burning. Farmers are fleeing. Religious hatreds have turned cities into graveyards. Amidst this devastation, a thin, nearsighted man walks alone beneath the sky, clutching a manuscript, his thoughts fixed not on earth but on heavenly harmonies. He is Johannes Kepler, and while the world fractures around him, he seeks unity not in politics but in numbers. This is the story of how Kepler, through grief, hunger, and isolation, forged laws that would one day launch satellites, guide spacecraft, and whisper the quiet music of planetary orbits into the ears of modern science. Epitome Astronomiae Copernicanae, Copernicus refined. Though Kepler had already formulated his 3 laws by 1619, he knew they would not live long unless embedded within a more comprehensive framework. Thus began one of his most ambitious projects, the epitome of Copernican astronomy. This was not merely a defense of Copernicus. It was a complete rewriting of the universe. Kepler translated Copernican ideas into mathematical rules, moving them from speculative philosophy into something approaching modern astronomy. He explained planetary motion using his 3 laws, defended heliocentrism as not just a model but a physical truth, and outlined his vision of the cosmos governed by force and distance ideas that hinted at Newtonian mechanics decades before Newton was born. He wrote the epitome in the vernacular, not Latin, so that students could read it. He wanted a generation raised not on epicycles and crystal spheres, but on ellipses and motion. And yet few read it in his time. The Cosmic Music, Harmonics Mundi. Perhaps his most heartfelt work, Harmonics Mundi, 1619, was Kepler's attempt to uncover the music of the spheres not metaphorically, but mathematically. He believed the distances and speeds of the planets formed harmonic ratios, akin to the notes of a celestial chord. Each planet, he thought, sang its own tone as it sped up and slowed down. Venus hummed a soft contralto, while Mercury danced in quick, high-pitched trills. Mars played a deep, irregular bass. This was not astrology. This was not superstition. For Kepler, this was divine architecture made audible through math. From this harmony emerged Kepler's 3rd law. The square of a planet's orbital period is proportional to the cube of its average distance from the Sun. In effect, the farther a planet is from the Sun, the more slowly it moves and in a predictable, measurable way. This law united space and time, elegantly and empirically. It gave astronomers a tool to understand motion beyond Earth's orbit. It was the first universal scaling law in celestial mechanics. The tables of the future, Rudolphine tables. Before Kepler, planetary position tables were riddled with inaccuracies. Sailors, calendar makers, and navigators depended on them, yet they failed frequently. The most accurate predictions came from outdated Ptolemaic methods. Kepler sought to fix that. Using Tycho Brahe's observational data, he produced the Rudolphine tables, named in honor of Emperor Rudolf II. These tables predicted planetary positions far more accurately than any before. The foundation was Tycho's tireless work, but the superstructure was Kepler's mathematics. He published the tables in 1627, a project delayed by poverty, printing problems, and war. Their accuracy stunned Europe. For the first time, planetary motion could be predicted reliably and not by appeals to authority, but by numbers. They would remain the most authoritative ephemerides for nearly a century. Trials of body and soul. While Kepler crafted universal laws, his personal world crumbled. He buried his beloved wife Barbara and several of his children. He lived in exile from his home due to religious persecution. His pay from imperial appointments was frequently delayed or denied altogether. In 1615, his mother Katharina was arrested in the town of Leonberg on charges of witchcraft, a not uncommon fate in an era of suspicion and superstition. Kepler threw himself into her defense. He studied law to better advocate for her, traveling back and forth across the war-torn countryside. After more than a year, he succeeded in securing her release. She died shortly afterward. In his writings, he never blamed the accusers. He blamed ignorance, and he vowed to replace ignorance with reason. The lonely visionary. By the end of his life, Kepler was recognized but not revered. His books sold poorly. His theories were admired by few. Galileo dismissed Kepler's elliptical orbits, preferring the cleaner circular Copernican model. The Church had placed some of his works on the index of forbidden books due to his Protestant faith and heliocentric advocacy. Even Tycho Brahe's followers, still loyal to the geoheliocentric compromise, often rejected Kepler's ideas. And yet he remained tireless. He wrote of a distant future where someone might build on his work. Perhaps there will be another who, using these foundations, will raise a more magnificent structure. He died in 1630 in the town of Regensburg, aged 58, his final book unfinished, his grave later lost to war. But his ideas would outlive kingdoms. Why Kepler mattered. Kepler's laws were more than clever observations. They marked a pivot point between ancient cosmology and modern science. He discarded perfect circles. He rejected celestial spheres. He made motion measurable. His insistence that physical laws governed the heavens laid the groundwork for Newtonian mechanics. Without Kepler's commitment to data, harmony, and mathematical realism, Newton's Principia might never have been written. The planets no longer wandered as divine mysteries. They orbited in knowable paths, governed by natural forces. He had moved astronomy from geometry to physics. Unresolved thought. Kepler had found the laws of motion, but not the force behind them. How could this force reach across the void of space? What kept the planets in orbit without ropes, gears, or glass spheres? Would the final missing principle come from the falling of an appler, the rise of a new idea? It is the middle of the 17th century, and Europe is beginning to stir with a new energy. The devastating 30 Years' War is winding down. Trade and printing expand. Universities slowly return to life. And in a small English town, a young man walks alone in the countryside, pondering something strange. Why does the moon not fall? Why does a stone fall to the earth, but not the moon? And could the same force that governs falling apples also govern the stars? This is the bridge between Kepler and Newton, between motion and mechanism, between what happens and why it happens. Kepler's mathematical ghost. Johannes Kepler had died in relative obscurity in 1630, his ideas appreciated by only a small circle of scholars. His three laws had not yet been widely accepted. Even Galileo, with all his brilliance, was reluctant to embrace Kepler's ellipses and variable speeds. The dominant worldview was still heavily Aristotelian in many circles. The heavens and earth operated by different rules. The cosmos was filled with invisible spheres, perfect circles, and divine harmony. And yet something was shifting. Kepler's tables worked. His predictions were accurate. His mathematical description of orbits began to whisper to the next generation of thinkers, those who were growing tired of vague metaphysics and philosophical declarations. They wanted something more grounded, something that could explain. And then came Isaac Newton, a force across the void. Newton, born in 1642, was deeply aware of the work of his predecessors. He read Kepler's epitome of Copernican astronomy, studied Galileo's mechanics, and contemplated the heliocentric model as more than just a diagram. It was a real, physical system. But Newton asked a question no one had fully answered. If the planets are moving in ellipses, what keeps them in motion, and what holds them in orbit? Kepler had speculated about a force emanating from the sun, but he lacked the tools to define it. Newton, armed with calculus, which he developed independently, and a precise mathematical mind, took the leap. He proposed that a universal force gravitates every mass toward every other mass, no matter how far apart. And he proved it. From Kepler's laws to Newton's law of gravitation. Using Kepler's third law, which related time and distance, Newton realized that a force pulling inversely with the square of the distance between two objects could perfectly account for elliptical orbits. That is, F equals G times M1 times M2, R2, where F is the gravitational force, G is the gravitational constant, M1 and M2 are the masses, R is the distance between the centers of mass. This formula did what no other had done. It united Kepler's observational laws with a universal law of motion. Now, planetary paths weren't just patterns. They were consequences of an invisible, natural force acting constantly. Newton also explained why the planets sped up and slowed down, as Kepler had observed in his second law. It was the conservation of angular momentum, a concept Newton clarified through his laws of motion. What Kepler had described, Newton had explained. A unified system. Perhaps the greatest triumph of Newton's work was this: he erased the boundary between heaven and earth. For centuries, people believed that the cosmos was divided: celestial perfection above, terrestrial imperfection below. But Newton showed that the same laws governed falling apples and orbiting moons. The force that caused tides also governed the stars. In 1687, Newton published Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematicae Principia. It became one of the most influential scientific texts in history. In it, Newton cited Kepler repeatedly. He didn't erase the mystic mathematician, validated him. The epilogue of ellipses. After Newton, Kepler's laws were no longer obscure. They became standard teaching. His name became synonymous with planetary motion. His elliptical model replaced the perfect circles of antiquity. The music of the spheres had become the physics of the spheres. And yet, Kepler was more than a precursor. His insight chart, one often misunderstood, set the stage for an entirely new worldview. His belief in a mathematically ordered cosmosome that could be known not through authority, but through patient measurement and faith in numbershelt, birthed the modern scientific method. Tycho had built the island. Kepler had mapped the motion. Newton had found the law. Why it still matters. We live today in the echo of Kepler's laws. When spacecraft are launched to Mars, they follow Keplerian orbits. When satellites are placed in geosynchronous orbit, their motion obeys his principles. Every planet, comet, and moon in every solar system discovered follows a version of the laws Kepler first derived with little more than a compass, Tycho's data, and unshakable patience. Yet Kepler never saw the full impact of his work. He died thinking he had only begun to unlock the secrets of the universe. And in a way he had. Final reflection. What do we make of a man who endured personal tragedy, religious persecution, and professional neglect, yet still changed the way humanity sees the sky? Perhaps this, that the universe is not only vast and elegant, it is knowable, and that sometimes the clearest picture of the cosmos comes not from the largest telescope, but from the quiet, persistent labor of someone who refuses to look away from the numbers. In a world that often seeks easy answers, Kepler reminds us that truth is found in patience, in wonder, in the geometry of heaven. Story 4. Galileo Galilei and the telescope that shook the world. The sky had always been just beyond reach, a dome of stars, admired but untouchable. For millennia, humans had charted its movements by eye, drawn lines between constellations, and written stories on its canvas. But in 1609, a man raised a simple tube of glass toward the heavens and everything changed. His name was Galileo Galilei, and though he didn't invent the telescope, he was the first to truly use it to challenge centuries of belief, to elevate mathematics over metaphysics, and to spark a controversy that would echo through science, religion, and philosophy for centuries to come. This is the story of a man who pointed a lens toward the moon and found that the sky was not what it seemed. The early life of a questioner. Galileo was born in Pisa in 1564, the same year that Michelangelo died and Shakespeare was born. His father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician and theorist who instilled in him a love for reason and skepticism. In a time when tradition ruled education, Vincenzo taught his son to trust measurement over authority. Galileo entered the University of Pisa to study medicine, but soon abandoned it for mathematics, much to his father's disappointment. He was fascinated by motion, geometry, and how the world worked. He observed things most scholars ignored: how objects fell, how pendulums swung, how balance worked. At a time when Aristotle's teachings were law, Galileo asked questions. Why should heavier objects fall faster? Why should motion require a constant cause? What if Aristotle had simply been wrong? He began teaching mathematics in Padua, a university town under Venetian control, and quietly built a reputation for boldness and brilliance. But his most famous work began when he turned his gaze upward. The arrival of the telescope. In 1608, rumors reached Venice of a new invention in the Netherlands, a spyglass that could make distant objects appear closer. Merchants and military men were intrigued. The news soon reached Galileo. Within months, he had built his own improved version. His telescope magnified objects by up to 20 times, far more powerful than anything available in Venice. He demonstrated it to Venetian officials by showing them ships arriving in the harbor hours before they were visible to the naked eye. The demonstration was a success. Galileo was rewarded with a raise, a permanent professorship, and increasing fame. But he wasn't content with looking at ships. He turned his lens toward the sky. And what he saw would shake the foundations of the ancient world. The moon is not perfect. Aristotle taught that the heavens were perfect and changing, smooth, divine. The moon was thought to be a polished, crystalline sphere. But when Galileo looked through his telescope, he saw shadows, craters, mountains. Light and darkness played across the surface like sunlight on rugged terrain. He sketched it, recorded it, published it. In 1610, he released Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, a short book filled with his telescopic observations. The moon, he declared, was not smooth at all. It was Earth-like, imperfect, material, flawed. If the moon, long a symbol of divine perfection, had craters, then what else had humanity misunderstood? Jupiter and its moons. But Galileo wasn't done. On January 7, 1610, he observed a curious alignment near Jupiter's three tiny stars. The next night they had moved. A fourth appeared. Over several nights he realized they weren't stars at all. They were moons orbiting Jupiter. This discovery was revolutionary. According to Ptolemaic cosmology, all celestial bodies orbited the Earth. But here were four new worlds orbiting another planet. If moons could orbit Jupiter, then the Earth was no longer the only center of motion in the cosmos. The discovery didn't just support Copernicus, it undermined Aristotle and Ptolemy directly. Galileo named them the Medicean stars, in honor of the powerful Medici family, securing patronage from the Grand Duke of Tuscany. But the scientific implications were larger than politics. The sky had become a place of motion, of imperfection, of surprise. Venus and the death of geocentrism. Later in 1610, Galileo observed Venus. Through his telescope, he saw that Venus displayed a full set of phases, like the moon crescent, gibbous full. According to the Ptolemaic model, this was impossible. Venus orbited closer to Earth than the Sun did. It could never show a full set of phases from Earth's point of view. But in the Copernican model, Venus orbited the Sun. Its changing position relative to Earth and the Sun explained its phases perfectly. Galileo had found direct observational proof of heliocentrism. He was not the first to suggest it, nor the first to build a mathematical case, but he was the first to see it. And once seen, it could not be unseen. Trouble on the horizon. Galileo's discoveries made him a celebrity. He was welcomed in courts, praised by intellectuals, and feared by those in power. But his work wasn't just scientific, it was philosophical and theological. By endorsing the Copernican model, Galileo was openly challenging not just Aristotle, but the interpretation of Scripture. Many biblical passages referred to a stationary Earth. To suggest otherwise was heresy to some. At first, Galileo was cautious. He wrote letters explaining how Scripture and science could coexist. He insisted that the Bible taught how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. But his tone grew bolder, his enemies grew sharper, the Church began to pay attention. In 1616, the Catholic Church officially condemned the heliocentric model as formally heretical. Copernicus's book was suspended pending revision. Galileo was warned not to teach it as truth. He paused, but not for long. Unresolved thought. Galileo had seen what others had only guessed. But in a world ruled by tradition and authority, would seeing be enough? What would happen when truth, observed through a lens, collided with power defended from a pulpit? Would Galileo recant or resist? The year is 1624. Galileo Galilei, now in his 60s, is celebrated across Europe. He has discovered moons orbiting Jupiter, mapped the rough terrain of the moon, seen the full phases of Venus, and witnessed sunspots crawling across the face of the sun. His telescope has brought the heavens down to Earth. But while the sky had revealed itself to him, the world around him was growing darker. The Catholic Church, once cautiously tolerant of Galileo's observations, was hardening its stance. Heliocentrism had moved from controversial theory to theological threat. Still, Galileo believed he could persuade them with reason, with rhetoric, and with a bold literary device, a dialogue. It would nearly cost him everything. A new pope, a new hope. In 1623, Galileo's longtime friend and admirer, Cardinal Maffei Barberini, was elected Pope Urban VIII. The news thrilled Galileo. He had known Urban for years and hoped his elevation might mean a more tolerant approach to science. Urban even invited Galileo to visit Rome. They discussed science, scripture, and the structure of the cosmos. Encouraged, Galileo believed he had found a way to reintroduce Copernicanism carefully, as a hypothesis, not as established fact. But the political climate was still precarious. The Church had declared heliocentrism formally heretical in 1616. Galileo had been warned not to teach or defend it. Still, he believed he could toe the line if he framed his argument as a dialogue between different perspectives. And so he began work on his most famous and most dangerous book, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. Published in 1632, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems presented a fictional conversation over 4 days between 3 characters. Salviati, an intelligent supporter of Copernicus, representing Galileo's own views. Simplicio, a defender of Ptolemaic and Aristotelian cosmology. Sagredo, a neutral and thoughtful gentleman serving as a curious listener. The structure allowed Galileo to present Copernican arguments in a persuasive, elegant form while technically maintaining the guise of impartiality. He did not declare heliocentrism to be true. Instead, he allowed Salviati to argue for it compellingly. But Simplicio, the defender of geocentrism, was portrayed as bumbling, confused, and critical, used phrases that closely resembled statements Pope Urban VIII had personally made. It was either a grave miscalculation or a subtle insult. Either way, it would not be forgiven. Reaction and censorship. The reaction from the Church was swift and severe. Though Galileo had obtained a license to publish, the dialogue was soon banned. Its printing was halted. Copies were confiscated. Galileo was summoned to Rome to stand trial before the Roman Inquisition. He was 68 years old. He suffered from arthritis, recurring illness, and near blindness. Nevertheless, he traveled under house arrest to Rome in 1633 to answer charges of heresy. The trial was not just about science, it was about disobedience. The Church accused Galileo of violating the 1616 edict by defending heliocentrism as truth. Galileo argued that he had only presented it hypothetically, as instructed. But the dialogue's tone made this defense difficult to maintain. The trial of Galileo. Galileo was interrogated for weeks. He was shown instruments of torture not necessarily used, but displayed as a warning. He recanted under threat of violence. On June 22, 1633, the Church delivered its sentence. Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy. His book was banned. He was forbidden to teach or promote heliocentrism. He was sentenced to house arrest for life. According to legend, as he rose from kneeling to recant, Galileo whispered, "E per se muove," and yet it moves. It is likely apocryphal, but even if unsaid, the sentiment hung in the air. The earth moved, and no trial could stop it. Life under house arrest. Galileo returned to his villa in Arcetri near Florence. He was old, ill, and defeated in the eyes of the Church, but he was not finished. Even under surveillance, he continued to write. In 1638, he published discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to 2 new sciences, a work that laid the foundations for modern physics. Smuggled out and printed in Leiden, it explored the strength of materials, motion, and falling bodies. In it, Galileo described inertia, acceleration, and parabolic trajectories, principles that Newton would later refine. Galileo was nearly blind by the time of its publication, and completely so when he died in 1642. His grave in Florence was denied a public monument until many years after his death. The Church had silenced him, but not forever. The legacy of the dialogue. The dialogue was not just a book about astronomy. It was a manifesto for reason. Galileo wrote in the Italian vernacular so it could reach a wide audience. He framed science as a conversation, not a doctrine. He used logic and observation instead of appeal to authority. He did not just argue that the earth moved. He showed that looking, measuring, and questioning were acts of truth. It is difficult to overstate the influence of that idea. Centuries later, in 1992, the Catholic Church formally acknowledged its error in condemning Galileo. His telescope, his dialogue, and his courage had reshaped the world. Unresolved thought. Galileo had seen the stars, challenged the Church, and laid the groundwork for modern science. But even as the Earth spun and the planets orbited silently above him, the question remained: what force kept them moving? Who would unify Kepler's orbits, Galileo's motion, and the pull that shaped the universe? Galileo Galilei spent his final years confined to a modest villa nestled among the hills of Arcetri, just outside Florence. The inquisitors had silenced his voice in public, but not his mind. Though blind, old, and watched by the Church, Galileo continued to shape the very foundations of modern science. In the end, he did more than observe the sky. He redefined motion, evidence, and the nature of truth itself. This is the closing act of Galileo's story, not the story of telescopes and moons, but of the physics that would outlive him and the worldview that he helped to build. The two new sciences. In 1638, Galileo's final major work, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Relating to Two New Sciences, was published in the Dutch city of Leiden. It was a miracle of persistence. The book summarized 3 decades of Galileo's thinking on physics, focusing on the strength of materials, the motion of objects. Because he was under house arrest and the Church had banned his publications in Italy, the manuscript was secretly passed to Protestant printers abroad. Smuggled, copied, and finally printed, it reached audiences across Europe. The book is presented as a dialogue, like his earlier dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, but this time it avoids direct controversy with the Church. Instead, it returns to questions as old as Aristotle. Why do objects fall? What keeps them moving? What is the nature of acceleration? Galileo answered with logic, mathematics, and quiet defiance. Motion reimagined. Before Galileo, Aristotle had dominated physics. He taught that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones, and that motion required a continuous force to be sustained. Galileo tore these ideas apart. He devised thought experiments. He dropped balls from towers. He rolled spheres down inclined planes. He reasoned that if air resistance were removed, all objects would fall at the same rate, whether feather or stone. And he formulated the principle of inertia. An object in motion remains in motion unless acted upon by an external force. This alone was revolutionary. It meant that motion was not unnatural, that a moving object would continue to move unless something like friction or resistance slowed it down. The implications extended beyond Earth. If no force was needed to keep something moving, then perhaps celestial bodies could move without constant divine or mechanical propulsion. The stars and planets might follow their paths not by being carried on crystalline spheres, but because nothing was stopping them. The parabola and the cannonball. Galileo also investigated projectile motion. He was the first to understand that the path of a projectile like a cannonball is a parabola, not a straight line or a mystical curve. By combining two motions, horizontal inertia and vertical acceleration, due to gravity, created a coherent model of how things move through space. He showed that acceleration due to gravity was uniform, that objects in free fall gained speed at a constant rate. He even measured this acceleration, about 9.8 ms2, though his instruments were crude. His approach was empirical but abstract, measured but idealized. It was physics in the service of principle, not just observation. And for the first time, Earth's motion could be described with the same tools used to describe the heavens. From thought to theory. Though Galileo never used calculus, his work paved the way for it. He analyzed infinitely small intervals, divided time into measurable units, and imagined curves that could be described with exact laws. These methods prefigured the ideas that Newton and Leibniz would formalize later in the century. Most importantly, Galileo trusted the world could be known through measurement and mathematics. This was a radical idea in a time when mystery, tradition, and divine causes still dominated most explanations. He once wrote, "The book of nature is written in the language of mathematics," and he read it better than almost anyone of his time. The human cost. But Galileo's work came at a price. He was excommunicated from scholarly life, unable to speak freely, cut off from universities and publishers. He went blind in 1638, perhaps from cataracts or glaucoma, spending his last years dictating to assistants. He suffered personal losses: the death of his beloved daughter Maria Celeste, the betrayal of former allies, and the bitter awareness that his discoveries had been condemned by the very institutions he had hoped to enlighten. Yet he never wavered in his belief that observation and reason must lead, even when they contradicted the authorities of his day. He died in 1642, the same year Isaac Newton was born, a poetic turn, as if science had passed its torch from one mind to the next. The world he left behind. Galileo did not know Newton, but Newton knew Galileo. In his famous phrase, Newton wrote, "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Galileo was one of those giants. His work on motion was the bedrock for Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation. Newton completed what Galileo had begun, unifying terrestrial and celestial mechanics under a single, coherent framework. But none of it Kepler's laws, Newton's Principia. The idea of a clockwork universe would have been possible without Galileo's insistence that the laws of motion were the same everywhere. The heavens and the earth were not separate realms. They were one system, governed by natural laws, not mystical forces. A universe that moves. In the end, what Galileo did was simple but profound. He refused to take Aristotle's word for it. He refused to believe that perfection lay in the sky and imperfection on the earth. He challenged the idea that questions were dangerous. He took a telescope, pointed it upward, and listened to what the universe said back. He changed not just astronomy, but how we know. Final reflection. When you stare at the moon through a modern telescope, trace the craters Galileo sketched by candlelight. When a rocket follows a curved arc into orbit, remember the parabolas he discovered. When satellites circle the Earth, thank the man who dared to say that motion doesn't need permission. Galileo moved more than planets moved minds. And once the Earth moved, so did everything else. Story 5. Isaac Newton, the quiet alchemist of gravity. The year is 1665. In the fields of Lincolnshire, England, the late summer sun shines through dust-thick windows of a country estate called Woolsthorpe Manor. There, in the quiet of isolation, a 22-year-old student returns home from Cambridge University. The campus has been closed shut down by the plague that has reached London and is now creeping northward. The world is sick and afraid. But in the solitude of this rural manor, untouched by lectures or laboratories, a young man begins to think freely about light, motion, time, and the invisible forces that might govern everything from a falling apple to the orbits of planets. His name is Isaac Newton, and over the next 18 months, in what later came to be known as his Annus Mirabilis Year of Wonders, will lay the foundations of modern physics. A shy child with watchful eyes. Isaac Newton was born on Christmas Day, 1642, the same year Galileo Galilei died. He arrived prematurely and was so small that his mother later said he could have fit in a quart mug. His father, a farmer also named Isaac, had died just months before. His childhood was far from peaceful. His mother remarried and left him in the care of his grandmother. He grew into a quiet, withdrawn boy, moody, solitary, prone to anger but fiercely intelligent. He built sundials, windmills, and water clocks. He carved his name into the walls of his home. At school, he was unimpressive at first, more interested in doodling machines than memorizing Latin. But when a classmate insulted him, Newton turned his energy to academics, determined to outdo everyone. He succeeded. By 1661, he entered Trinity College, Cambridge. There, he encountered the ideas of Descartes, Galileo, and Kepler, but the curriculum still leaned heavily on Aristotle. Newton was unimpressed. He began to read outside the official syllabi, absorbing the new mechanical philosophies that were sweeping Europe. But just as he was finding his footing, the Great Plague of 1665 closed the university. Newton returned home. The world slowed. He began to think. The apple that didn't fall alone. The famous story is simple. Newton sat beneath an apple tree and saw a fruit fall. He wondered, why did it fall straight down? Why didn't it drift sideways? Why did it accelerate? But the apple alone didn't inspire him. Newton had been thinking deeply about motion and force for years. What the apple did was focus his attention. Could the force pulling the apple downward be the same force that kept the moon in orbit? At that time, many believed that celestial bodies were governed by special, divine laws, separate from earthly physics. The heavens were different. They were perfect. But Newton dared to unify them. He imagined a force that pulled all matter through a force that grew weaker with distance, but never disappeared. He began to sketch diagrams, write formulas, and test ideas. He didn't yet have a name for it, but he was inventing the idea of universal gravity. Invention in isolation. During this year of isolation, Newton also began to invent calculus, though he called it the method of fluxions. Formulate early laws of motion. Experiment with optics, using prisms to split white light into colors. These were not casual reflections. Newton's notebooks from this period no preserved filled with restless, detailed notes. He drew orbit diagrams and calculated rates of change. He scribbled equations in margins. He wondered about inertia, friction, centripetal force. All without mentors, all without laboratories, all without fame. This quiet, withdrawn young man, alone on a farm during a pandemic, was building the scaffolding of modern science. A mind of many worlds. But Newton was not only a physicist. He was also an alchemist, a theologian, and a deep believer in hidden truths. He studied ancient texts, biblical prophecy, and mystical writings. He believed that God had designed the universe with purpose and that the role of science was to uncover the rules behind the divine architecture. He spent more time on theology and alchemy than on physics, though he rarely published these works. He wrote in secret about the transmutation of metals, the structure of the cosmos, and the end of days. To Newton, science and spirituality were not separate. Understanding motion, light, and force was a way of understanding God's mind. This belief gave his work urgency. The universe wasn't random, it was knowable. The reluctant publisher. When Newton returned to Cambridge in 1667, he was appointed a Fellow of Trinity College. He became a professor in 1669, only 26 years old, but he remained reclusive. He rarely lectured. He avoided controversy. Though he had made discoveries that could change science forever, he refused to publish. Why? He feared criticism. He had seen how brutal academic debates could be, and Newton did not handle disagreement well. His temper was sharp, his pride easily wounded. It would take nearly 20 years before his ideas on motion and gravity would be fully revealed to the world. And when he finally did publish them, it was because of a comet and a challenge. The call from Halley. In the 1680s, astronomer Edmund Halley, later famous for the comet that bears his name, visited Newton to ask a simple question. What kind of curve would a planet follow if it were attracted to the sun by a force that diminished with the square of the distance? Newton replied, an ellipse. Startled, Halley asked how he knew. Newton said he had done the math but had misplaced the papers. Halley urged him to write it down again. Encouraged, Newton expanded his ideas, brought together years of work, and over the next few years wrote the manuscript that would become one of the most important scientific books in history. Philosophiae Naturalis, Principia Mathematica, the Principia. Published in 1687, it would make Newton a legend. But that's a story for the next section. Unresolved thought. If gravity reached from the Earth to the Moon and from the Sun to the planets, what else might it govern? Could a single law explain everything that moves? How far could Newton's invisible force stretch? And could the universe truly be one system, bound by a single set of rules? In the summer of 1687, a heavy Latin manuscript rolled off a Cambridge press, funded by Edmund Halley and written in dense prose, long paragraphs and mathematical geometry rather than modern equations. Its title was modest, its impact immeasurable. Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, or Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. It would be known simply as the Principia, and it would forever change how humanity understood the universe. Isaac Newton, now in his mid-40s, had spent 2 decades perfecting ideas born during his plague-year retreat in Woolsthorpe. Now, reluctantly, publicly, he revealed them. The 3 laws of motion. At the heart of the Principia were 3 deceptively simple statements. Today, every schoolchild knows them, but in Newton's time, they were revolutionary. First law, the law of inertia. Every body perseveres in its state of rest, or of uniform motion in a straight line, unless it is compelled to change that state by forces impressed upon it. This directly contradicted centuries of Aristotelian thought. According to Newton, motion did not require a cause to continually to change. A moving object would keep moving forever unless something interfered. This law extended the realm of natural motion beyond Earth. Planets in orbit, not driven by celestial spheres, they simply continued in motion deflected by gravity. Second law, force and acceleration. The change of motion is proportional to the motive force impressed, and is made in the direction of the straight line in which that force is impressed. This is the familiar F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. Newton didn't write it in this exact form, but the concept was born here. It provided a quantitative relationship between mass, motion, and force, a toolkit for analyzing everything from falling apples to cannon fire, from tides to planetary orbits. Third law, action and reaction. To every action there is always an equal and opposite reaction. This was more than a slogan. It explained recoil, orbits, and equilibrium. If the Earth pulled on the Moon also pulled on the Earth. If the Sun pulled the planets inward, they pulled the Sun ever so slightly outward. This law helped Newton envision a universe in perfect balance, not chaos. The law of universal gravitation. The true triumph of the Principia was Newton's universal law of gravitation. Every particle of matter attracts every other particle with a force directly proportional to the product of their masses, and inversely proportional to the square of the distance between them. Mathematically, F equals G times M1 times M2, R2. This single formula unified the falling apple and the orbiting moon, the tides and the tilt of planets, Kepler's laws and Galileo's motion. Newton proved that the same force pulling objects toward Earth also governed the orbits of the planets, comets, and even the shape of galaxies. He didn't invent the idea of gravity. People had always known things fell, but he made gravity universal, mathematical, and predictive. For the first time, the entire cosmos was governed by a single natural law. Kepler's laws reborn. Kepler had described planetary motion with 3 laws but without explanation. Newton, using his gravitational theory, derived Kepler's laws from first principles. Elliptical orbits, a consequence of gravity plus inertia. Equal areas in equal times, explained by angular momentum. Orbital periods and distances, derivable from mass and force. Kepler had observed, Newton had explained. The Principia was not merely a physics textbook, it was a cosmic unifier. From cannonballs to comets, from tides to timekeeping, it all fell under Newton's laws. The resistance of the mind. Despite its brilliance, the Principia was not easily read. It was written in Latin, steeped in geometric proofs, and avoided algebraic notation, which Newton disliked. Even fellow scientists struggled with it. Moreover, Newton's worldview challenged deeply held assumptions. That the universe was finite and harmonious, not infinite and mechanistic. That the heavens were not ruled by divine will, but by mathematical law. That Earth was not at the center not just spatially, but intellectually. Still, among the intellectual elite of Europe, particularly in England, France, and the Dutch Republic, Newton's work was soon revered. It was adopted, debated, and extended. And it marked the climax of the scientific revolution. Newton's personality in print. Newton's mind was precise and relentless, but his personality was notoriously difficult. The Principia reflected this, terse, methodical, and unapologetically confident. He offered little credit to predecessors and no humility about his achievement. He rarely mentioned Kepler or Galileo by name, despite building upon their work, and he deliberately avoided the work of his rival, Robert Hooke, with whom he had feuded over the nature of planetary motion. Yet the book's power transcended these quarrels. It laid bare a vision of the universe in motion, predictable, knowable, and governed by invisible laws. The mechanized cosmos. With the Principia, Newton transformed the universe from a mystical hierarchy into a mechanical system like a vast celestial clock, wound at creation and left to run according to fixed rules. To Enlightenment thinkers, this was profound. It suggested that knowledge, not divine mystery, was the path to truth. It inspired philosophers, inventors, and scientists alike. Voltaire later wrote, "Before Newton, natural philosophy was a chaos. He brought light into this chaos." And yet Newton himself believed that God was the author of these laws. The universe was mechanical, yes, but designed. Unanswered questions. Even in the Principia, some mysteries remained. What was gravity, really? Newton described it mathematically, but refused to speculate on its cause. How did gravity act at a distance, without contact? Could gravity change over time, or was it truly constant? He admitted he did not know. He famously wrote, "I frame no hypotheses." He offered no mechanism for gravity, just the law. And that was enough. Unresolved thought. If Newton described how gravity worked, but not what caused it, would future generations be content with mathematical certainty or search for a deeper answer? Could gravity itself be just one part of a greater, hidden structure? By the time he published the Principia in 1687, Isaac Newton had become the intellectual sun around which all European science orbited. And yet, even as he mapped the heavens and wrote the laws that governed the planets, he remained a deeply private, complex, and contradictory figure, part natural philosopher, part mystic, part bureaucrat, and part recluse. This is the story of what came after the Principia, the consolidation of Newton's legacy, his secret studies, and the slow evolution of how the world understood both his greatness and his strangeness. The philosopher becomes a statesman. Following the publication of the Principia, Newton's reputation soared. He was elected to Parliament in 1689, though he reportedly spoke only once, to complain about a cold draft in the chamber. In 1696, he was appointed warden of the Royal Mint, and 3 years later became its master, a role he would hold until his death. Far from ceremonial, Newton took the job seriously. He reformed the English currency, combating widespread counterfeiting with forensic precision. He even oversaw the prosecution of counterfeiters, at times acting more like a detective than a scientist interviewing suspects, examining forged coins, and pursuing criminal cases with the same tireless logic he had once applied to planetary motion. And yet, for all his public stature, Newton remained private. He published little after the Principia, and he rarely revealed the full scope of his thoughts even to close friends. The secret alchemist. Unbeknownst to most of his contemporaries, Newton devoted vast amounts of his life to the study of alchemy, precursor to modern chemistry, but also a deeply mystical, symbolic pursuit. He wrote over 1 million words on the subject, in notebooks that would remain unpublished for centuries. Newton read the alchemists of old Hermes Trismegistus, Paracelsus, Basilius Valentinus, and sought to discover the philosopher's stone, the mythical substance that could transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal life. He experimented in secret, mixing chemicals, heating crucibles, and recording results. He was not merely looking for physical transformation, but divine knowledge, its ultimate key to God's design of the universe. To Newton, alchemy was not superstition. It was a sacred science, hidden in symbols, lost to time but waiting to be deciphered. Just as gravity had once been invisible and mysterious, perhaps the secrets of matter, spirit, and transformation were real, if only one looked with the right eyes. Today, these writings remain difficult to categorize. Were they folly, or just another dimension of Newton's radical curiosity? Theology and the Hand of God. Newton also wrote extensively on theology. In fact, he spent more time in his life studying scripture than studying mathematics. He believed that Christianity had been corrupted over time, that true knowledge of God had been obscured by the church. He rejected the Trinity, a belief that would have been considered heresy in his time, and kept his views carefully hidden. He studied biblical prophecy, trying to calculate the date of the apocalypse. He believed the universe was a kind of divine machine, set in motion by God, and that science could reveal his handiwork. But he did not believe science made God unnecessary. On the contrary, he believed that laws were evidence of intentional randomness. To Newton, God was not an occasional actor but a constant sustainer, holding all things together. The rivalries and isolation. Newton's brilliance was often shadowed by deep insecurity and a harsh temperament. He feuded bitterly with Robert Hooke, John Flamsteed, and most famously Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, over credit for the invention of calculus. Though both Newton and Leibniz developed forms of calculus independently, Newton's version came earlier, yet he hesitated to publish it. When Leibniz published first, Newton accused him of plagiarism. The dispute became a long and bitter priority controversy that outlived them both. Newton, serving as president of the Royal Society, even oversaw a committee to review the dispute and anonymously wrote its final report himself. These conflicts took a toll. Newton withdrew further, increasingly isolated even as his reputation grew. He became more involved in managing institutions than creating new science. And yet, even in silence, his influence deepened. Knighted and immortalized. In 1705, Queen Anne knighted Isaac Newton, first scientist to receive such an honor for intellectual achievement. By the early 18th century, Newton was not just a man. He was a symbol of reason, of enlightenment, of the idea that the universe could be understood through mathematics and careful observation. He died on March 20, 1727, at the age of 84. He had never married. His papers were scattered, much of his work in alchemy and theology unpublished, hidden from the scientific world that idolized him. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, near kings and poets. His tomb bears the Latin inscription, "Here lies Isaac Newton, a man with a mind almost divine." Newton's legacy. Newton's laws remained unchallenged for over 2 centuries. Engineers, astronomers, and inventors built machines, maps, and predictions on his principles. His gravity described the tides, the motions of comets, and the behavior of cannonballs. He gave humanity a predictable, rational, mathematical universe we now call the Newtonian worldview. And yet, even this was not the final word. In the 20th century, Albert Einstein would show that Newton's laws, while precise, were only an approximation, that time and space themselves were not fixed, but curved by gravity, that the apple did not just fall, it bent the spacetime around it. Even so, Newton's greatness remains untouched, not because he said the last word, but because he gave science the courage to ask better questions. Final reflection. Isaac Newton is often remembered as a man of cold rationality, of equations and falling apples. But he was also a mystic, a seeker, a man haunted by the invisible. He saw the universe not as a machine without God, but as a reflection of divine order. He believed that every law discovered was another step toward understanding the mind of the Creator. In his life, he gave us the means to leave the earth, to map the stars, and to trust that the cosmos could be measured. But he also taught us humility, that even the greatest laws are only windows, not ends. As he once wrote, near the end of his life, "I do not know what I may appear to the world, but to myself, I seem to have been only like a boy playing on the seashore, finding a smoother pebble or a prettier shell than ordinary, whilst the great ocean of truth lay all undiscovered before me." Story 6. The Royal Society, Gentlemen and Their Instruments. It is London, 1660. The air still carries the smoke of civil war, and the city's cobbled streets echo with the return of monarchy. Charles II has just taken the throne after more than a decade of Puritan rule. The theaters are reopening, music and fashion return, and behind closed doors in coffee houses and college halls, another kind of restoration is quietly underway, the restoration of natural philosophy in the form of something entirely new. A group of curious men, mathematicians, physicians, astronomers, and experimenters meet regularly in the rooms of Gresham College. They come not to pray, not to preach, not to write poetry or politics, but to ask questions, to observe, to measure, to test. From this irregular congregation will grow the Royal Society of London for improving natural knowledge. The Royal Society, a phrase that for centuries to come would define what it meant to do science. A new kind of fellowship. The men who formed the early Royal Society were not uniform in background or belief. Some were noblemen, others scholars. They disagreed on theology, on politics, on philosophy. But they shared a common dissatisfaction with hearsay, with dogma, and with the way knowledge had stagnated in a world still bound by Aristotle and Galen. They were inspired by Francis Bacon, whose Novum Organum had argued that knowledge should come from experience and induction, not syllogism or tradition. In short, they wanted to see what the world did, not just say what they thought it ought to do. Their motto, adopted in 1663, said it all. Nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it. This wasn't rebellion, it was method. The invisible made visible. The early Royal Society meetings focused on practical questions. How does light reflect? What shape does a falling object make? What happens when mercury is sealed in a vacuum? They didn't seek to answer every question at once. Instead, they poked, prodded, and experimented. They made air pumps, barometers, and microscopes. They dissected animals and froze water in glass tubes. For the first time, instruments, not philosophy, took center stage in the study of nature. The microscope revealed tiny creatures in pond water, animalcules, wriggling and multiplying, suggesting an invisible world teeming with life. The telescope showed craters on the moon and sunspots on the hewn imperfections in celestial bodies once thought divine. Their instruments didn't just measure, they challenged belief. The power of publication. In 1665, the Society began publishing its own journal Philosophical Transactions, the world's first scientific periodical. Rather than guard their discoveries, they shared them. This act transformed science from a secretive art to a public conversation. The journal reported on experiments, correspondence, observations, and even failures. It was peer-reviewed in spirit, if not yet in formal process. More importantly, it created a community of knowledge that stretched beyond London to Paris, Amsterdam, and eventually to the American colonies. If the Society had a religion, it was transparency. Mr. Boyle's air pump. Among the most famous early fellows was Robert Boyle, the son of an Irish earl and one of the founders of modern chemistry. Boyle's most famous experiments involved air, its weight, its compressibility, and its necessity for life. He built a vacuum chamber, an elegant device of brass and glass that could extract air from a sealed space. Into this chamber he placed flames, birds, insects. They gasped, flickered, and died. It was gruesome but revelatory. Boyle showed that air was not nothing. It was a substance with pressure and weight necessary for both combustion and respiration. It wasn't empty space, it was matter. He formulated what would later be called Boyle's law. The pressure of a gas is inversely proportional to its volume. But Boyle's experiments did more than prove physical laws. They showed that experiments could settle arguments. The Royal Society didn't just theorize, it demonstrated. Experiments as entertainment. Society meetings weren't always solemn. They were sometimes spectacles, a mix of laboratory, theater, and curiosity shop. They floated magnets on water, weighed feathers against lead, electrified frogs, spun gyroscopes, and distilled spirits. These public performances, sometimes open to observers and foreign guests, helped legitimize the society and secure royal support. But they weren't mere entertainment. They were experiments done in front of witnesses, using standard methods with written records. This made science not only collaborative but credible. Women and the society. Officially, the Royal Society was an institution of men. Its early fellows were gentlemen, white, wealthy, and often aristocratic. But that doesn't mean women had no role. Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, attended a meeting in 1667, a rare event for a woman. She was a philosopher in her own right, though the society viewed her visit as a curiosity. Elsewhere, women corresponded with members, translated texts, and performed experiments at home. Their roles were unofficial, often invisible but foundational. Only centuries later would women begin to be formally recognized as fellows. Political storms and scientific calm. Through the Restoration, the Glorious Revolution, and the Enlightenment, the Royal Society maintained a unique position, politically neutral, focused on knowledge above sectarianism. While other institutions fractured along religious or national lines, the Society remained a hub of international science. It welcomed Newton, who became president in 1703 and reshaped its agenda around his ideas. Under his leadership, the Society championed precision, mathematics, and the unity of celestial and terrestrial physics. But its foundation had already been laid in dusty lecture halls, on brass instruments, and in the scribbled notes of men who believed that the world could be understood by looking at it, not by believing others' words about it. Unresolved thought. If the Royal Society created a new method of investigating the world, what would happen as new minds far beyond London began to adopt its approach? Could the tools of the gentleman become the power of the people? As the 18th century dawned, The Royal Society was no longer merely a collection of eccentric experimenters meeting in rented rooms. It had become a powerful institution whose observations, letters, and instruments helped standardize the methods of science across Europe. But its members did more than peer into microscopes or calculate planetary orbits. They also charted coastlines, classified species, recorded earthquakes, and timed eclipses. In their work, we see the fusion of two great drives, the need to know and the need to organize. Science, as practiced by the Royal Society, became both a quest and a ledger. The world as specimen. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the British Empire expanded its global reach, and with it came new specimen splints, minerals, animals, and even diseases. Naval voyages, colonization, and trade flooded the society with artifacts from distant shores. And the society welcomed them. Ships returned with strange seeds and dried leaves from the West Indies, fossils from quarries, sea shells from New Holland, Australia, monkey skulls from Africa, bottles containing curious liquids, insects in lacquered boxes. The Royal Society did not merely want to observe the world, it wanted to catalog it. Fellows began keeping lists, descriptions, drawings. They published long inventories in the Philosophical Transactions, complete with diagrams and Latin taxonomies. In an age before digital databases or international standards, this was slow, meticulous work, but it laid the foundations for modern natural history. Hans Sloane, collector of everything. One figure looms especially large in this era of encyclopedic curiosity, Sir Hans Sloane. Sloane was a physician, naturalist, and indefatigable collector. He traveled to Jamaica in the 1680s and returned with over 800 plant species, as well as extensive notes on local medicine and botany. But Sloane didn't stop there. He amassed over 71,000 objects during his lifetime: coins, books, bones, dried animals, scrolls, seeds, and instruments. His house became a museum in all but name. After his death in 1753, his collection formed the nucleus of the British Museum, of the largest repositories of human and natural history in the world. Sloane's work exemplified the Society's ambition to make the unknown known, to collect everything, and to sort it into rational categories. The Clockwork Universe. As Newton's influence deepened, the Society increasingly adopted the metaphor of the clockwork universe, the idea that the cosmos was a vast machine, composed of parts governed by laws. Astronomers like John Flamsteed, the first Astronomer Royal, compiled star catalogues from the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. Cartographers improved their maps. Clockmakers refined marine chronometers to measure longitude at sea. Time, space, and motion all were now subject to measurement, not myth. The Society's observations became data points for navigation, agriculture, and empire. It was science with a purpose. The fellows at work. Who were these fellows? They included John Ray, a botanist who worked to classify plants systematically; Edmund Halley, who calculated the orbit of the comet that bears his name; Stephen Gray, who conducted some of the earliest electrical experiments, suspending buoys on silk cords to show that charge could be transferred; Benjamin Franklin, an American who would later correspond with the Society about lightning, storms, and the nature of electricity. They were gentlemen, yes, but also tinkerers, observers, and above all, communicators. Their strength lay not in perfection, but in persistence. The power of the letter. In an age without email or even reliable roads, the scientific letter was the lifeblood of communication. Fellows wrote to one another, constantly reporting new observations, sharing gossip about instruments, and describing local phenomena. A flood in Yorkshire, a new kind of mold in a bread loaf, a mysterious illness in a fishing village. Letters were often read aloud at society meetings. Some were published in the Philosophical Transactions, edited with light hand by the Society's secretary. This open, imperfect flow of ideas made science cumulative. No one person had to solve everything. It was enough to observe carefully, describe accurately, and send it on. The Royal Society became a kind of distributed mind, absorbing the world through its members. Trouble at the edges. Not all contributions were welcomed equally. While the Society claimed to seek knowledge regardless of source, there remained hierarchies. Letters from provincial towns were sometimes dismissed. Observations by non-English, non-aristocratic, or female contributors often went unacknowledged. The Society's embrace of gentlemen carried both prestige and prejudice. And yet cracks began to form. The more the world learned, the more evident it became that truth could come from anywhere. A farmer's almanac might record a rare eclipse. A midwife's notes might hold the key to understanding childbirth mortality. A merchant's journal might contain data on global winds. The ideals of the Society, openness, method, observation, would eventually demand a wider lens. The scientific public. As the 18th century wore on, science left the confines of the lecture hall and entered the salon, the coffee house, and the public stage. Scientific demonstrations became popular entertainment. Experiments with vacuums, electricity, and optics were performed for fee-paying audiences. Scientific books for laypeople became bestsellers. And the Royal Society sat at the center of it, all not only as a scientific authority, but as a symbol of enlightenment itself. A world where knowledge came from witnessing, not believing. A world where instruments, not ideology, ruled. Unresolved thought. As the world became more knowable and measurable, what would happen when the Society's instruments encountered phenomena they couldn't explain? Would observation always be enough, or would science itself need to evolve? By the dawn of the 19th century, the Royal Society had become one of the most respected institutions in the world. Its influence stretched across continents and oceans, stitched into the fabric of empire and education alike. But the very success of its mission to spread methodical observation and rational inquiry would lead to an unexpected transformation. The Society was no longer the only stage for natural philosophy. The age of amateur gentlemen was giving way to something more ambitious, more professional, and more diverse. The Royal Society had helped create the tools and rules of modern science, and it had to learn how to share them. This final chapter is about the Society's growing pains, its evolution, and the slow shift from curiosity cabinet to research institution. It's about the scientific method leaving the drawing rooms of London to take root in laboratories, factories, schools, and, eventually, into the minds of the public. Institutional growth and stagnation. As the 1700s gave way to the 1800s, the Royal Society had become established, even conservative. It had moved from Gresham College to Crane Court, and eventually into Somerset House, its position literally and symbolically central to London life. But with institutional authority came bureaucracy. By the early 19th century, many began to complain that the Society had grown insular. Its elections favored aristocrats and titled men over active experimenters. Some fellows hadn't published anything in decades. Others were better known for political clout than scientific insight. The very motto of the Society, nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, seemed to be undermined by its own structure. Enter Charles Babbage. Charles Babbage and the Call for Reform. In 1830, the mathematician and engineer Charles Babbage published a scathing pamphlet titled Reflections on the Decline of Science in England. In it, he accused the Royal Society of becoming a club for amateurs. He claimed its leadership was chosen more for birth than for contribution. He asked why France and Germany were producing more scientific work than England, and pointed directly at the Society's gatekeeping. Babbage wasn't alone. Others, like John Herschel and William Whewell, joined the call for reform. They wanted a royal society that actively supported research, that encouraged experimentation, and that included working scientists, not just titled hobbyists. In response, the society slowly restructured, tightening its membership rules, increasing support for publication, and beginning to fund scientific work directly. The seeds of the modern research institution had been planted. Professionalization of science. As universities began to offer dedicated training in physics, chemistry, and biology, the world of science shifted from amateur enthusiasm to professional expertise. The society adapted by forming specialist committees, such as those on electricity, meteorology, and geology. It offered grants, began peer review, and slowly embraced a broader view of science as not just observation, but explanation supported by mathematics, theory, and prediction. New organizations followed the society's lead, often breaking off into niche fields. The Geological Society, 1807. The Chemical Society, 1841. The Royal Astronomical Society, 1820. The once broad umbrella of natural philosophy had become a family of disciplines, each with its own methods and instruments. The Royal Society, like a proud elder, presided over this growing tree of knowledge. Inclusion and exclusion. Despite these changes, the society still struggled with inclusion. Women, for example, were not admitted as fellows until 1945, despite the fact that many had been publishing, experimenting, and contributing for centuries. Figures like Mary Somerville, a 19th-century polymath and science writer, were highly respected but excluded from full participation. Her books were read by the Queen herself, but she could not attend society meetings. The same held for many contributors from the colonies, from working-class backgrounds, or from outside Anglican England. The society had pushed the boundaries of inquiry, but not always the boundaries of who could inquire. Still, the growing influence of public lectures, published science, and broader education began to erode these walls. Slowly, science began to belong to more people. Modern achievements. In the centuries that followed, the Royal Society would remain at the heart of scientific life. It supported Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859. It awarded medals to Maxwell, Faraday, Hawking, and countless others. It launched advisory reports, helping to guide public policy on energy, medicine, and the environment. It continued publishing the Philosophical Transactions, world's oldest surviving scientific journal. The society became not just a place of observation, but of debate, critique, and collaboration. It remained, above all, committed to the principle that science should be shared and that the best ideas are those that can be tested, measured, and repeated. A legacy of method, not just discovery. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Royal Society is not any single breakthrough or individual. Rather, it is the cultivation of method. The idea that knowledge comes from careful observation, reproducible experiments, open communication, healthy skepticism, and a willingness to revise ideas in light of evidence. These are now so embedded in modern science that we take them for granted, but they were not always obvious. They were argued over, refined, and practiced again and again by fellows with microscopes, letters, and brass instruments. In this way, the Royal Society helped create a new kind of knowledge, collective, public, and empirical. From then to now. Today, the Royal Society still exists, a vibrant part of global science, with a motto unchanged since the 17th century, nullius in verba. Its headquarters on Carlton House Terrace contains centuries of correspondence, books, and instruments, but its spirit is not confined to those walls. It lives on in every lab notebook, in every peer-reviewed paper, in every classroom that teaches the scientific method. What began as a group of gentlemen performing curious experiments by candlelight became the blueprint for modern science. Final reflection. In a world now shaped by data, algorithms, and vast technological complexity, it is easy to forget the quiet origins of our scientific heritage. But the values that built the Royal Society still matter. That we should ask questions not because we are certain, but because we are curious. That we should doubt even our own conclusions, especially when they are popular. That knowledge must be earned not by rank or wealth, but by evidence. And that anyone can be a witness, a recorder, a thinker so long as they are willing to look, measure, and share. In the long arc of human understanding, the Royal Society stands as a turning point where knowledge began to leave the libraries and enter the world.